It's 9:05. So hello everyone, my name is Maria Mujahid. I am a student at Emmanuel College majoring in political science. And I would like to welcome you to the Winter 2021 George E. Danis Eastern Mediterranean Security and Diplomacy Seminar. The IEMS in cooperation with the Department of International Relations of the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration in Romania and the Institute of International Relations in Athens, Greece, will be hosting this one-week program of focused lectures, presentations, and panel discussions. The one-week program will bring experts from different regions in 3 sets of presentations and panel discussions aimed at assessing a changing America and a dynamic Eastern Mediterranean. The seminar will address the multifaceted intersectional issues that explain the significance of the Eastern Mediterranean in regional, trans-regional, and global terms by considering issues such as climate change, migration, energy resources and security, religio-cultural identities, and soft power, as well as public health pandemics and inter- and interstate relations. With country experts from cases across the Mediterranean basin, the Middle East, and Caucasus, and the transatlantic space, the seminar will introduce students to the historically grounded significance of the Eastern Mediterranean for contemporary U.S. foreign and security policy, and for key global trends in the 21st century. Our presenters this week come from different countries of the region, as well as backgrounds. We have a mixture of policymakers, diplomats, and academics. And so today I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our facilitator, Dr. Petros Vamvakas, the director of the Institute of Eastern Mediterranean Studies. And our guest speaker today is Mr. Michael Wahid Hanna, who will be introduced shortly. So before turning our microphone to our facilitator and our speaker, I wanted to let you know that I will be the host of this event. I will guide the Q&A. That will be 30 to 45-minute presentation. So the duration of the program will be 1 hour and 30 minutes. And I'd like to ask you all to please turn off your microphones and to use either the chat or the raise your hand for questions. Again, we will try to answer all questions. If there's any issues, please let me know. Just make sure you drop in your questions in the Q&A box. It's nice to have you all here, and I hope that we have a productive presentation and discussion. And now I yield the floor over to Dr. Vamvakas.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being with us one more time. This has been a great week of discussion, of presentations and panels. And we're finishing up fairly strong with a great presenter. And our keynote to finish this great week, as we started out with Mr. Hoi Yi earlier on Monday, and we're finishing up with someone that I have read the last few years, and I have been very impressed, and I'm very happy that he accepted our invitation to be with us. This has been a collaboration of the last week with the Karamanlis Chair at the Fletcher School, the Fletcher Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy, the International Relations Department of the National University of Political Studies, and Public Administration in Romania, and the International Institute of the Institute of International Relations in Athens. And I say all this because this has been a collaborative effort. Mr. Hanna was first mentioned by our co-sponsor, Professor Prodromou, which, you know, it was when the name was mentioned, you know, it was just an immediate yes, and we just hope that he would be with us this morning, because, as I said, he has been somebody that has written extensively, and he has said some great things. He's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation, and he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Ray Center on Law and Security at New York University School of Law. Hanna works on issues of international security, international law, and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and South Asia. He is the co-author of Hybrid Actors, Armed Groups, and State Fragmentation in the Middle East, 2019, and co-editor of Arab Politics Beyond the Uprisings, Experiments in an Era of Resurgent Authoritarianism, in 2017, Order from the Ashes, New Foundations for Security and the Middle East in 2018, and Citizenship and Its Discontents, The Struggle for Rights and Pluralism, Inclusion in the Middle East in 2019. And you can tell just from this brief description how prolific he has been in the last couple of years in presenting this, a lot of what's going on in that part of the world following the Arab Spring, and this part of the world as far as issues of democracy and citizenship. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, and also tell the audience that I have placed on the chat one of Mr. Wahid, Mr. Hanna's essays that's on the site of the Century Foundation. So I would urge you to download it and read it, and then get a better sense of what he has to say. Thank you for being here with us, if I may, Michael, and we are waiting for your remarks.
Well, thank you so much for those very kind, probably too kind words, and I'm very happy to be here, see some familiar faces like Elizabeth, and it's, you know, I have a lot of thoughts at the moment because we are 10 years, just about, since the Arab uprisings began in earnest. They began in Tunisia in December of 2010, so they've had their sort of 10-year anniversary there. But the kind of domino effect that we saw that really picked up steam when the uprisings and the mass mobilization expanded to Egypt, there's obviously been a lot of content and thinking, perhaps overshadowed by our own domestic drama here in the United States. But for those who worked in the region, it's been a kind of reflective moment to think about where the region stands 10 years after the uprisings. And of course, that moment intersects quite clearly with a shift here in the United States, a shift that will, I think, have some fairly profound implications for the region as well, after a period that I would describe, and I will describe, as one of unfortunate drift. So I'll start first with the region itself, going back, looking at the uprisings, because I think it's useful to think about what the uprisings were, what they meant, and I think the uprisings and the response of outside actors continue to offer us relevant lessons that I think are applicable and important for those who are now hopefully taking U.S. policy in the region in a different direction. So the uprisings themselves, I was there for a good chunk of that time. I was in Tahrir Square, and sorry, my computer was. So I was in Tahrir Square from early February until later on when Mubarak was toppled, and it was clear at the time that this was something quite different, something that I knew I was witnessing history as it unfolded. And I remember one late night in the square, I was there with the late Anthony Shadid, who was covering the events for the New York Times. And this was probably 1 o'clock in the morning. They'd closed the square. Security had sort of locked down, looking for infiltrators and the such. This was close to February 11th when Hosni Mubarak, Egypt's longtime autocratic ruler, stepped down. And Anthony looked over at me and he said, and I will always remember this, it was very poignant at the time and remained so, but he said, I've been covering this region now for 15 years, and this is the first time I'm covering a good story. this is good news for the first time ever. And it was good news. And I think that's one key point that I want to make. And that is that these mobilizations, these uprisings created genuine political openings. And I think it's tempting to allow the real failures of most of these uprisings to color our perceptions of what they were and what they meant at the time. The track record has not been great. What we see really is unmitigated failure, and in some cases, real catastrophe and human suffering, with the exception really of Tunisia. And it's almost cliche at this point to hold up Tunisia as the region's one bright spot. But it is the region's really one bright spot. And there are reasons for that. There are reasons that Tunisia took a different course than a place like Egypt. There are those kind of important domestic drivers rooted in country conditions and decision-making and leadership. And on this point, I'll expand just a bit. The uprisings themselves were linked phenomenon. They represented a cascade moment. They occurred within an information environment that was linked in somewhat unique ways. So, the programmatic Arab nationalism of the 1960s is long dead. There's no question about that. But there remains a kind of shared political consciousness. There remains a shared media space that helped drive this moment forward. The uprisings clearly fed on themselves, and there is no way to view them as individual actions and developments. They were clearly linked and created this quite remarkable effect that took root across the region. And again, the first place where this happened, Tunisia, I think clearly at this point is the only good news story to emerge from the uprisings. A point that I mentioned, and I'll expand upon, is this idea of what the uprisings meant at the time. I think there is a little bit of hindsight bias that has crept in over the years, and people have begun to see the uprisings themselves as effectively doomed from the start. And this is a view that I really do reject. I think it's wrong. I think if we look particularly at the case that I am most enmeshed with and know the best, the case of Egypt, this was a genuine political opening. There were possibilities for a genuine revolution. And I'm very keen to always say uprisings and not revolutions, because I don't think what happened in most of the region was a revolution. I think the possibility for revolutionary change existed. And we saw this in Egypt. A place that, of course, lacked institutions, it lacked a democratic political culture, it lacked much of the building blocks that would have made a transition easier. There is no question about that. Those challenges are and were very real. It is very difficult to transpose this kind of political moment onto a society that lacks the existence of these kinds of political norms. That creates real hurdles for political change. That being said, the drivers of failure are largely the product of decision-making, of leadership, and different decisions could have produced different outcomes in places. And if we take the case of Egypt, I think it is important that we not forget that the drivers of the failings of that uprising were largely a function of domestic decisions and failures of leadership within Egyptian society. I'll get to outside actors because they clearly had a negative impact on events in the region, particularly regional actors. But to go back to Egypt, you know, the United States and other countries were largely reactive. You know, I think it's important to accord the people of the region their agency and to recognize that what happened in Egypt wasn't a function of decision-making in Washington, D.C. The United States chose at one point not to stand in the way of what was happening on the ground, but it was events on the ground that were dictating. This was not an uprising and a series of uprisings that happened because of outside decision-making. And that's important. I think far too often we want to strip agency from citizens of the region. And this was a case in which the United States, Europe, other actors within the region were reactive and were reacting to what was happening on the ground. Clearly they had some impact on decision-making. It's not that they lacked any and all influence, but they weren't the main drivers of events on the ground. And so we go back to, you know, to why some uprisings, most of them failed, and why Tunisia, for instance, succeeded in relative terms. I think there are some Tunisians who clearly are unimpressed with where Tunisia is 10 years later. But where Tunisia is 10 years later is that it continues to sustain its own democratic political life. And it has kept that going. It has not reverted, as many of the other parts of the region have, but if we take Egypt in particular, it has not reverted to the autocratic, authoritarian model of governance that is stronger and more ferocious and is wholly resurgent in Egypt under President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. So what differentiates? What happened between these two cases that produce these very different outcomes? And you know, first, I think I talked about the fact that this was a shared political moment throughout the region, but that country conditions and local domestic decision-making made a big difference. And this is a case in point. Obviously, scale matters. Egypt is a huge country, 100 million plus. Tunisia is a quite small country. The scale of what faces political leaders in Egypt, the problems that a country like Egypt faces, look quite different from that of a smaller country like Tunisia. Tunisia has much fewer outside pressures that can produce quite negative results in the case of how outside actors engaged with the uprising and picking sides on both sides of the political divide in Egypt. So, you know, very different situations, and perhaps another quite consequential difference is the difference of the militaries, with Tunisia's military being historically apolitical, and of course Egypt's military forming the backbone of Egypt's autocratic regime from the 1952 revolution onwards. That the nature of military engagement with governance and politics has changed over time, but the history of political involvement remained, and of course that was to prove quite consequential for events in Egypt. So clearly quite different situations. But the thing that distinguished the Tunisian transition was an ability of civilians who had a fair bit of trust built up over years, mostly in exile, working and thinking and meeting together. But a trust to bring events back from the brink, to avoid zero-sum conflicts over identity, and to sustain a transition. And for critics of the transition in Tunisia, they would say that approach has sustained a kind of hollow transition, a transition that continues political life, but doesn't produce real revolutionary political change. And of course, there is some degree of truth to that, but the alternative, the kind of zero-sum politics that becomes existential, produced great failure in Egypt. And I don't want to belabor these points because there's a lot to discuss about what has happened since, and other points about what is to be done now. But failure was not inevitable. Failure was a product in many of these societies of poor leadership, I think that leads me into another big point, and that is that that poor leadership, it doesn't come from nowhere. It is a product of the authoritarian trap that these societies find themselves in, and it is a quite vicious cycle, and it is one that really remains constant, and it is something that an incoming Biden administration will be hard-pressed to deal with. And that is that these authoritarian entities are intent on sustaining their rule. And in so doing so, they have stripped these societies of individual political thought, dissent, institutions of civil society, robust political party life, and in doing so, they have stripped their societies of the kinds of institutions and practices that are most likely to produce successful politics, particularly at a kind of democratic level. And so when these societies were faced with the really daunting task of trying to create sustainable transitions to democratic governance, they lacked those institutions. They lacked that political practice. They lacked those norms and traditions. They lacked the civil society that could buttress that kind of transition and sustainment of democratic political life. And it is that cycle that is really at the heart of failure of governance in the Arab world. And of course, what is most necessary, and it is of course the thing that is an impossibility now even more than ever, is thoughtful, top-down reform. And that is the great tragedy. And so, there is no possibility in Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's Egypt for any kind of, let alone democratic opening, but even a kind of course correction that would pull back on the levers of repression. And so these societies are in fact trapped. They lack the building blocks to produce political change. Their leadership is quite intent on blocking and forestalling any possibility of positive democratic political change, and so strips them of the tools necessary to produce such outcomes. And of course, in a setting where any kind of political reform is anathema. And so the only pathway to political change, as we saw in 2010 and 2011, was political rupture, was mass mobilization leading to the toppling of regimes and various kinds of regime change. And this now is another big theme that I think is important for us to note, and that is, if you are drawing up a roadmap for political change, political rupture is a bad idea. In this case, it is perhaps the only pathway to change. But that again highlights this conundrum. But political ruptures are dangerous. They create vacuums. They create insecurity and instability. They can create a very high sense of sectarian sentiment. So, political ruptures are about the last pathway one would choose if you were trying to consciously design a successful model for political change. And yet that is essentially the only thing on offer for the citizens of the region in terms of trying to produce an evolution in political thought and political practice throughout the Middle East. And so, regardless of intent, and we see this, and we'll get to this with the issue of military intervention, which is the kind of adjunct set of issues to some of these uprisings. But these ruptures are, even in the cases where with the best intentions, and most of these, most of the actors that participated in these uprisings did have good intentions. Not all. Many exploited these openings for nefarious ends. But ruptures are dangerous. They are, in the case of Egypt, the aftermath of the violence of the state and some of the counter-violence saw police effectively go on strike, disappear from the streets. Various kinds of armed actors gained strength in that vacuum. We saw that in the rise of militancy in the Sinai Peninsula that continues to this day. One outgrowth of all that is the reaction of citizens. One of the major deterrents to political action now in the region is the fear of the citizenry. In the aftermath of quite turbulent transitions following these ruptures, many citizens are loath to think about uprisings, to think about genuine political change, for fear of what it has brought in their own societies, and particularly looking more broadly. So for many Egyptians who have gone through this turbulent period and have settled into what is clearly a quite suboptimal status quo, it does look for some of them much better than the kinds of violent instability that exist next door in Libya, that exist and have existed in Syria or Yemen. And so, political ruptures are quite difficult to tame, and it's a great tragedy that this has effectively become the only pathway to change in the region. And of course, many of these societies experience military conflict. In Egypt, there was state violence, there was counter-violence, but nothing like on the scale of those societies, like the ones I mentioned, Libya, Yemen, and Syria in particular stand out. Also, Iraq with the rise of ISIS and the civil conflict that brought on. But many of these states and societies experienced real civil conflict and violence. And the outside actors, including the United States, that became involved in trying to harness the uprisings as they morphed into civil conflict, but trying to engage in even limited kinds of military intervention to produce political change, have been quite disastrously unsuccessful. And it's another key lesson, I think, and insight of this period, and it's one that we shouldn't need reminders of, and that is the kind of uncontrollable dynamics that attend to military interventions. And even military interventions undertaken with the best of intentions are quite difficult to harness for positive political change. And so, I think, one would think that a country that undertook quite unsuccessful military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq would not need any reminders of how fraught and difficult military intervention is. But there was, I have some sympathy for decision makers during the uprisings, in the United States that were largely reacting to events on the ground, reacting to a sense that the region was headed to a particular political outcome. There was a sense of wanting to be on the right side of history. And of course, there was quite appalling state violence. If we take the case of Libya, if we take the case of Syria, more than any others, the state was the main driver. The regime, the Assad regime was the main driver of civil conflict. It unleashed really quite appalling levels of suffering on its citizens to try to squash the possibility of political change. And so the United States and other actors were reacting to that reality. But I think it's, again, really important to emphasize how uncontrollable and dangerous military intervention is, even when undertaken in a limited sense. And that was the initial foray into Libya was done under a limited mandate, one that was focused on the protection of civilians in Benghazi. It morphed into something quite different. It morphed into regime change, and has had fairly disastrous effect. I've mentioned at various junctures the role of outside actors, the United States and others, which was, I think, quite clearly very reactive. This moment in the region was one driven by conditions within the region and not by decisions elsewhere. But I mentioned the United States being quite reactive in that process, and late to making decisions. And I think there are reasonable grounds for critique. But the most pernicious actors throughout this period were the regional actors who picked sides. Quite clearly, Qatar and Turkey believed that they were picking the kind of winning side of history and backing Islamists and Muslim Brotherhood affiliates throughout the region. The counter to that was the reaction of the Gulf, led by Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which saw the possibility of this kind of political change, particularly that gave room for Islamist political expression and political success, as a quite dangerous precedent for the region and something to be avoided at all costs. And it fueled and it fed into this zero-sum process that brought ruin to too much of the region. And the other thing that has always been quite striking to me since is quite clearly the limited political leverage that the United States possessed to try to force or influence the trajectory of political events in the region. And nowhere is that clearer than in Egypt in the summer of 2013, when the transition came to a kind of grinding halt following the intervention of the Egyptian military and the coup of July 3rd, following mass demonstrations and mass mobilization against Mohammed Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood-led government. The United States was quite clear in its message for the most part. I think there's some mixed messages, but the top-down message to Egyptian decision makers and Abdel Fattah al-Sisi himself was against a coup, an emphasis on the potential legal and political ramifications that this would have, and yet faced with monetary political backing from the Gulf and others, the United States was unable to forestall that eventuality. You know, leverage is this kind of mythical idea. And of course, the United States has never had huge leverage to drive domestic political events in the region, even at the height of its power. And of course, there has been relative decline since the kind of peak of American power during the late Cold War and the post-Cold War. But it's important to sort of compare apples to apples. And American power was never, during the Cold War, concerned with driving domestic political outcomes. It was quite keen to focus on alignment in the Cold War setting, but it never tried to produce and was quite indifferent to the domestic politics that underlined that kind of top-level affiliation. And so when, in the post-Cold War period, it began to try to engage in domestic, using its leverage or influence to produce positive political change, it's been largely unsuccessful, and that's not surprising, frankly. You know, U.S. leverage doesn't work as a tool for producing political reform. It never has, and I think it's unrealistic to imagine that it can. And that's, you know, another one of those big takeaways for me, just how limited U.S. leverage is in this kind of setting. And it's one that I think the United States still hasn't fully grappled with. There's a kind of magical thinking around American power still that assumes that that the right kinds of pressure and the right kinds of leverage can produce positive political outcomes, and I'm quite skeptical. And of course, you know, the region now, to kind of fast forward a few years, is marked by resurgent authoritarianism, and of course that is not just a regional phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that we have seen throughout the world. You know, without being hyperbolic, I think we have seen the emergence of authoritarianism in multiple settings, in Europe, in Latin America, and that resurgence has, I think, been fueled and boosted by the stance of the United States under Donald Trump. You know, I think the incoming Biden administration has made it clear that they are interested in grappling with that legacy. And it's not just President-elect Biden. It is others over the course of recent years within Europe and within the Democratic Party in particular that have seen, that have converged on this idea about countering authoritarianism. I think some of that has to do with the 2016 election and the role of Russia in American politics. But it also is a reaction to Donald Trump and his embrace of dictatorship, his embrace of authoritarianism in the Middle East and elsewhere. We've seen this in Brazil and Hungary and other places. And so not just Biden, but people like Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and many others within the orbit of the Democratic Party have focused on this issue of resurgent authoritarianism as a major plank of American foreign policy. Now, it comes at a curious time in some respects. because the United States, of course, is in the midst of its own democratic backsliding, democratic erosion, a crisis of legitimacy. And so in some ways it is an awkward moment to be thinking and talking about the crisis of authoritarianism. And there are those who have pointed out the kind of decreased legitimacy of the United States to lead a kind of global charge in the midst of its own relative decline and its own backsliding, highlighted, of course, for all the world to see on January 6th in really appalling scenes at the U.S. Capitol. You know, for some it might seem quite preposterous to think that the United States is in a position to take on this mantle again. And of course, there's real legitimacy to that critique. But I think the way that the United States has to think about democracy, authoritarianism, is as a kind of shared global crisis. And I think the only way that that can happen is a quite frank recognition and acknowledgement for all the world as to the fragility of democracy. I think there is no shame, and in fact, it would be quite absurd to not, begin global engagement on this note. But I think it's quite important to have any kind of ability to talk about these issues clearly. The United States has to be quite frank about its own shortcomings. And in doing so, I think there is no reason that the United States should then forget about democracy or ignore authoritarianism. I think there is a degree of hypocrisy around these issues that has always been problematic. There is a degree of scolding that is quite annoying and grating for many. And there's no reason that has to be the kind of default setting when it comes to US engagement on issues of democracy and human rights. But in terms of progressive politics, these things are linked. And I think a kind of realism that decides that it is unconcerned with democratization, authoritarianism elsewhere, I think is bad practice. I think we have to see the United States shift toward a longer-term view of what engagement on these issues means, a less hypocritical view that doesn't see this as a tool or a weapon, a cudgel to be used against enemies. And so Mike Pompeo has talked extensively about human rights in Iran or human rights in Venezuela or Cuba, and of course has given a blank check and a total pass for dictatorial allies and partners in the region. And of course that, I think that is bad practice. But there is no reason why the repair of democracy at home cannot be coupled with a genuine concern for democracy and against authoritarianism and its resurgent forms throughout the globe. So I don't want to see the United States give up on the issue. I want the United States to play a long game, a less hypocritical game, one that recognizes the limitations of its leverage and doesn't expect to see immediate gains. We have to have a kind of generational set of expectations, and this kind of brings me to some of my last points, and that is that if we recognize our limited leverage, then the concept that I think is important to think about becomes complicity. I don't think if we have major changes in the way that the United States engages with a country like Egypt, a long-standing security partner, one that has been the second largest recipient of the United States military aid and assistance after Israel. I don't think that any kind of major retooling of that aid package or conditionality or an effort to leverage our assistance is going to produce positive political outcomes. I don't see any reason to think that that is a tool that can be used in that kind of way. And so we are left with this notion for me of complicity about who and what we want to be engaged with, what we want to be seen as supporting in the world. And of course, there are authoritarian bargains that any country has to make. And of course, I wholly reject the kind of Manichaeanism of the Bush administration that refused engagement with any kind of perceived enemies. That's not what I want to reproduce. I want to have a engaged, dynamic diplomacy that engages with enemies, that sees diplomacy as a boon to the United States and not as a reward to adversaries and enemies. And so it is not that I would want to create bright red lines in which engagement with authoritarian regimes is a no-no, not at all. In fact, it's the reverse. But of course, there is a separate set of issues in terms of our security partners. I'm hopeful that that a Biden administration will begin to engage on this set of issues and begin to rethink our engagement in the region. I've argued very recently that Egypt is a very logical place to start. It doesn't present the same kinds of challenges that the Emirates and Saudi Arabia do, but I see Egypt as a kind of first opportunity for a United States that is trying to rationalize its position in the region, and I'm happy to get into that in our discussion if there's interest in why I think that's the case. But clearly we have an inflection point in the region, in the United States, and I am, guardedly optimistic that we will see some change. I think at the level of atmospherics, we will clearly see a major difference. We will not see the kind of frank embrace of dictatorship. There's this famous quote from Donald Trump where he talks about Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as his favorite dictator. I think that kind of unabashed embrace of authoritarianism is over. But changing the ship of state, shifting decades-old policies is quite difficult. It is hard, as we saw, following the coup in Egypt and the kind of tortured discussions that happened within the Obama administration for months and months in terms of how to react. So I have no illusions that change is easy or will be quick. But I do think there's an opportunity for many of us on the outside to engage productively on this set of issues. And of course, they have added salience even for us in the United States because, as I mentioned, we are, of course, in the midst of our own crisis of legitimacy and real stark and unfortunate backsliding on democracy that I think we will have to engage with for our own selves, not as a kind of platform to engage the world, but for the health of our own society and polity. And of course, if we do that, and if we are successful, then one positive outgrowth of that is a kind of a more settled and realistic platform from which to talk about these issues on the global stage. So I'll stop there. There's a lot that I've kind of gone over quite quickly, but I'm happy to engage with everyone's questions in this discussion.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hanna. I am going to turn over the floor to Dr. Van Bacchus for some quick commentary.
Thank you. Wow, it's in a short time you gave us a lot to think about, and I'm going to just make just a couple of comments because I see a lot of people are in the queue, and I'm going to also pass the floor to my colleague, Professor Pedromo, for a question. And I'm going to, the phrase that stuck with me is long game, less hypocritical when it comes to, dealing with democracy internally here in the United States. And my comment has to do with, it's almost like, this could also apply to the discussion we had in the 1990s about democracy, as far as spreading democracy or the universality of democracy, like all those arguments that we all read, from Diamond to even the Huntington, to the arguments that were all, and then it seems like there was an implementation in a, almost like we believed our own sort of myth as far as what democracy was. So we almost had like the wrong playbook as far as democracy was concerned to begin with. And then when that didn't work, we went to the old playbook, which was political order. Like we brought Huntington back, and we applied him in a very different way, like in a way that right now your comment had to do with Donald Trump saying, he's my favorite dictator, so to speak, like political order in a very perverse, a perverse kind of a way. So my comment and question to you, like overall, and I don't know, maybe we can go to the questions from the rest of the audience, is, do we have the right playbook? Can we even speak about democracy when we don't necessarily have a clear understanding of it? And it's almost like we have believed the clippings about democracy, but we don't necessarily understand what democracy takes. And this whole seminar is named by the benefactor is Georgie Danis, and he talks constantly about this idea of global citizenship and engagement and bringing the citizen back. So should we be talking about not democracy but the citizen? And is there is the material even there to create a citizen? Elizabeth, it's you.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks for that intro observation about democracy in question. Michael, I have two questions that are related. Having read your book on citizenship and its discontents, the subtitle is something I wanted to ask you about, Struggle for Rights and Pluralism and Inclusion. And I think that subtitle, when it comes to the region, the Eastern Med, the greater Middle East, but also to the United States, is particularly important for us to consider. And I wondered if you could say a little bit about U.S. foreign policy and its understanding, policymakers' understanding of the deep pluralism that once characterized the Eastern Mediterranean and yet has disappeared in very significant parts of it. And although I share your optimism for the Biden administration, for certainly a rupture with the policies of the Trump administration and even with the Bush 43 administration, I'm a skeptic when it comes to how well the Obama administration really did understand the pluralism in the region. And so I wondered if at the moment when the United States is grappling with its own history and present of pluralism and inclusion and what that might mean, and avoiding a kind of, teeter-totter swing from one extreme to another, whether you think that there are parts of the U.S. foreign policy establishment that really have a historicized understanding of the importance of sustaining pluralism in a changing Eastern Mediterranean, because I think it's that pluralism dynamic that will either continue to push towards authoritarianism or non-democratic practices, or help to push things in the other direction. So that's the first long question. And the second one is much shorter. You mentioned that the United States doesn't have a lot of leverage in the region, and yet we see a lot of shifts in the region which suggest opportunity. And in particular, we had a session this past week on the Abraham Quartet, on the Abraham Accords. And one of the places, it seems to me, one of the first outcomes of the Abraham Accords was the signing of a big defense package for the UAE by the US Congress. And I think it's very clear that in terms of military to military relations between the US and the Eastern Med, that those relationships are robust, they're deep, and they're very non-transparent. And yet they are a very important, I would submit, tool for the United States to encourage the kind of pluralism we've been talking about. Because instead the outcome, and particularly that's been the case in Egypt, but it's just a paradigmatic case for the region, the outcome has been sell, lots of, missiles, bombs, and other drones and other tools to the military-industrial complex in the region, and those are used against their own populations for homogenization and repression. So I wonder if you think that the incoming administration might look at things like CATSA and look at things like the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act and begin to use our military-industrial leverage a little bit more effectively to promote and support pluralism in the region.
Okay, so those are big questions. So I'll just take them sequentially, and of course I think there was a kind of post-Cold War arrogance that infected our view of political developments in negative ways. That it is clearly problematic, beyond the hypocrisy of when we invoked democracy and when we didn't. I think there's been a kind of, and this continues, a kind of ignoring of the kind of building blocks that are necessary to produce sustainable political outcomes. But the one thing that I do reject, and I've always rejected, is this kind of response in reaction that wants to reject the universalism of some of these issues. And oftentimes in quite crude, bigoted, racial ways. Huntington, I think, is a great example of this, but that wants to see democracy as a kind of preserve of specific political cultures, mainly the Western worldview and his famous Clash of Civilizations, and as something that is inimical or foreign or inhospitable in other parts of the world, and I just reject that. There are lots of Egyptians who may be discouraged with what democracy or the attempt to establish a democratic political outcome produced in Egypt, but those people don't need Samuel Huntington to tell them what is and what isn't possible, what they should and shouldn't care about. And those people wanted a say in their government. The uprising was supported by multiple kinds of actors in a kind of tactical alliance that broke down very quickly, but included anti-Islamists, Islamists, seculars, liberals, lots of, all of Egyptian society in many ways was there in the square in support of trying to produce a democratic political outcome. And so, there is a way in which we can be self-conscious, aware, less hypocritical, less arrogant, less preaching when we talk about these issues. But I think if you go in the other direction, then again, you begin to erode the agency of the people of the region. It's very easy to slip into a kind of bigoted view of the region that assumes that, that the Arabs aren't ready for democracy. I think that's a pretty problematic place to be. And so, again, I think there's no way to engage these issues at this juncture, looking at where the world is and looking at where the United States is and looking at where Europe is, without being serious about democratic renewal at home. I think one thing that has changed quite dramatically, and we saw this even at the time of the Arab uprisings coming on the heels of the 2008 financial crisis, was that the United States and Europe had very little to offer the region in terms of financial assistance. There was some IMF assistance to various countries, but the United States and Europe weren't there to step in to provide that kind of material assistance to try to buttress the transitions. And the countries that did step in a place like Egypt were the Gulf countries that effectively subsidized and kind of gave a guarantee to Sisi that if a coup was undertaken, that he had what in the end was $20 billion worth of financial assistance. So, it is the United States is in a different position, but I would hate to see us turn our back on this set of issues. I think that's the wrong approach. And there are many in the region themselves who care about these issues, and in expressing and using their own agency, would like to see these issues back on the agenda. Although of course the challenge is quite steep. It's steeper now than it even was then. So Elizabeth, to get to your two questions on inclusion, I think one thing that the WikiLeaks release and the cables showed in surprising ways, and I think it was actually a net plus to American diplomacy at the end of the day, was that a lot of American diplomats are pretty smart. They have a really good sense of what's going on. I mean, I think the Tunisian cables in particular, people were shocked. They said, my God, I mean, we never imagined the Americans had such a keen understanding of what was happening in Tunisia. And if they knew all this, why in the world did their policy look the way it did? And so I think there's always a divergence between, not always, and I don't want to speak too broadly, but there's always a divergence between the understanding of dynamics in the region and being able to guide policy in a way that is beneficial to those hoped outcomes. And that's particularly on the issue of inclusion and pluralism. That's particularly the case when military intervention is on the table. And so, the Iraq War, the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, under false auspices and arguably illegal under international law, one of the main outcomes of the conflict and strife that war produced over many years is the near total destruction of Iraq as a multi-ethnic and multi-sectarian society. And so many of the small religious minorities have almost been eradicated. The Christian population, the kind of largest of those other religious minority populations, has shrunk by more than 70%. And so, the kind of brute force of conflict is obviously the biggest driver of, in terms of erasing pluralism, in terms of destroying the bonds of inclusion. So any kind of militarized setting is going to be inhospitable for inclusion as a kind of major policy priority. But of course, even the rise of Islamism represents a separate kind of challenge to pluralism and inclusion. And that's one where I've had my differences with American policymakers. I think, for a variety of reasons, there has been a reluctance to kind of baldly face, particularly during the uprisings and the immediate aftermath, when Islamists, when many places like Egypt were the easiest people to deal with. I think, there was a kind of making up for lost time. And again, this goes back to this Manichaean view of the world in which Americans were previously barred from engaging with Islamists in Egypt and other countries in the region, which is a very myopic, silly approach to dealing with political dynamics. I mean, I think what I have advocated always is engage with all relevant political actors. And in some cases that even could include prescribed groups like Hezbollah and others. They represent the reality of political power in some places. but it isn't necessarily to embrace those actors. And so we've perversely, I think, in particular after 9/11, we've perversely taken this view of diplomacy as a kind of reward for those we engage with, and that's produced quite perverse dynamics. And so, we must engage with all variety of actor, and we have to do so with eyes wide open. And so, with Islamists, and this was a slightly problematic aspect of how we tried to make up for lost time in 2011 and 2012. Islamists are religious supremacists. In a place like Egypt, that entails a real hostility to the rights of Christians, which make up 10% of the population. And there's just no way of getting around that. And so, again, engagement, but eyes wide open. Inclusion has been a real sore spot for the region, going back to even the 50s and 60s with the kind of destruction and disappearance of the Jewish population in the midst of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And with the rise of Islamism, there's been sustained pressure on Christian minorities throughout the region. So, it's a major regional problem. I think one way not to encourage pluralism is the selective use of the minority issues as a kind of political weapon in the region. And I think the instrumentalization of this has been problematic. I'd like to see this be a bipartisan commitment that is an across-the-board one, and not a kind of convenient tool to be used to against perceived enemies. I mean, this is a bigger problem with the democracy, human rights space writ large. But we see this, with the championing of by the U.S. parts of the U.S. right of Sisi as a kind of champion of Christians and Copts, which is farcical. But it fits within a kind of broader political project that has instrumentalized human rights and minority issues in some settings, and de-emphasize them in others. And that's that problem of hypocrisy and selective engagement is one that that is across the board in this space. On the Abraham Accords, yes, it has fueled a kind of regional arms race, and there's a real need for regional security and regional security dialogue in the region. It's mostly absent. There's a lot of emerging regional defense cooperation, mostly along the lines of against Iran, but that's not going to breed long-term regional stability and security. Clearly, one area that needs immediate examination is arms sales. This major set of arms deals that are being pushed through at the end of the Trump administration to the UAE is quite problematic. It is one that has ignored longstanding practice in terms of engagement with Congress and congressional review. But one place that I hope we see immediate action, and this is one that I actually am quite optimistic about, is with respect to U.S. arms sales in the war in Yemen, which has been total catastrophe. I think U.S. engagement began in the Obama administration in somewhat reluctant ways. I think it was seen as one fight too far in terms of in the immediate aftermath of the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. The Obama administration was quite reluctant to essentially pick one more fight with its Gulf allies, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and so acquiesced to this conflict and support of it in the hopes that they would be able to tame it, that through targeting would make it less brutal. And of course, it was a disaster under the Obama administration, and that disaster really is accelerated under the Trump administration. Mike Pompeo's last gift in this regard was the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist group, which is one last act in service of his imagined political future. But it's a disaster, and it's one that has the capacity to produce famine in Yemen. And so there's a whole host of issues, from the designation of the Houthis to American arms sales to American engagement in targeting cooperation, that I hope will come to a very, very quick end. And surprisingly, this is something that has had some bipartisan support in Congress. There's a number of Republican lawmakers as well who have been quite vocal about their opposition to U.S. involvement in Yemen. And so this is, when I think about areas for quick action, I think clearly the war in Yemen is a place where not just weapon sales, but a whole host of issues related to U.S. engagement are going to be quite relevant very early on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hanna. So now I would like to, thank you, Mr. Hanna. So now I would like to ask some questions from the Q&A box. So the first question is by Ileana. So hello, Mr. Hanna. I have more questions, and I thank you very much for the clear points presented. The first question is, can we connect the success/failure of the revolution with specifically historically typologies of each country? It seems that authoritarian systems, no matter of who the leaders are, keep their territorial voters. And then there's another question, which I can repeat after, which is the percent of contribution of Turkey to counter-revolutionary success in Syria from the Azadi movements of the Kurds at the end of 2010, the movements of the Afghan al-Qaeda fighters in 2012. You're muted.
Yes. The first question, could you just repeat that quickly?
Can we connect the success/failure of the revolution with the specifically historically typologies of each country? It seems that authoritarian systems, no matter of who the leaders are, keep the territorial voters.
Okay, so on the first question, I'm not sure that I understand the territorial voters aspect, but in terms of historical typology, I mean, I guess, political culture matters, institutions matter. It is hard to produce democratic outcomes without those things in place, but they're not impossible. I mean, democracy is not some inherent attribute or feature of democratic societies. It is a thing that is forged out of whether it's monarchical regimes or empires or autocratic histories. These are things constructed by people, clearly very deliberately through various processes. But there is no historical determinism with respect to which regimes and which countries and which societies can become democratic. And so history matters, institutions matter, culture matters, but these things are not immutable. They change, they are susceptible to change over time, and I think we shouldn't see these things as historical givens. Autocrats do and can have the support of their populations. I mean, I think one mistake is to see the autocrats of the region as lacking any base of popular support, and of course they do have popular support. It's part of the problem, it is in places like Egypt or Syria. It is not the case simply of the people versus regimes. These regimes have real support for a variety of reasons. Some of them having to do with fear, some of them exhaustion, fear of instability and violence and conflict. But for a variety of reasons, these regimes do have bases of popular support, and that's something we have to contend with. but it's not a given, you know. So of course, there, particularly at this juncture in the region, there are various reasons why autocrats enjoy some support, but you know, there are very serious movements of opposition and discontent. We shouldn't see discontent and opposition and you know, rising deprivation and economic suffering as a kind of automatic trigger to uprising, because it's not. Really bad situations can sustain themselves for quite a long time. But obviously these are divided societies, and these are not societies in which autocratic rulers enjoy anything like universal support. In terms of Turkey, you know, I think Turkey had a very important opportunity in the early days of the uprisings, and I think it largely squandered that. You know, when Erdogan first came to post-Mubarak Egypt, he incensed many of the Muslim brothers because he talked about the importance of secularism and the importance of secularism to religious parties, and how these things were not in contradiction with each other. And I think some of the Muslim brothers that heard him speak were quite shocked. But of course, the way that Turkey then engaged in Egypt and other countries in the region was quite partisan and was quite zero-sum. They saw themselves as, along with Qatar, as siding with the victors in the region. They imagined a kind of Islamist tidal wave that would see them kind of as the kind of first among equals of Islamist-led regimes in the region. And, you know, I think they unnecessarily fueled the kind of zero-sum politics of the region, and squandered an opportunity to be a kind of interlocutor for all the parties, because of its own unique history with military coups, and some version of democracy, although that has eroded in considerable ways since. In 2011, you know, I think Turkey could still be seen as a functional democracy, and one with religious parties. I mean, it had all of this, these components that would have made them a very important player if they chose to act in a more broad-minded, less myopic way, a less partisan way. And they didn't, much to my frustration in terms of my own engagement with Turkish diplomats throughout the region. And of course, I think they were one part of the problem in Syria. Again, I think, you know, the Assad regime has to be seen as the major driver of the country's disaster. But of course, the outside interventions, particularly the militarized interventions of other actors in support of armed actors in Syria and later direct engagement militarily, has been a real disaster for Syria. And, you know, it's the kind of forum for untold human suffering, and has been a destabilizing feature of the region, and not just the region, but, you know, even in terms of fueling migration crises elsewhere. You know, Syria has been the kind of paradigm of failed uprising and civil conflict. And, you know, Turkey, along with many other countries, has played a negative role in that conflict.
Thank you for that. So we have time for one more question. I'm going to try to combine both questions. So would you be able to elaborate on your opinion? Do you think that there can be another Arab Spring in Egypt or any part of the region, especially in the near future? And then as well, do you think that the Western democracy, the Westphalian system, is declining?
Okay, so another Arab Spring. You know, it's almost, you know, it's impossible to know when something like a mass mobilization or uprising or a revolution will happen. It's a fool's game to try to think about predicting such a thing. I mean, the conditions under which an uprising could have arisen in Egypt existed for decades. They exist in many places. So again, misgovernance, deprivation, these are conditions that pertain to many societies for many years. I mean, there's again, there's no reason to imagine that there is some formulaic way to think about the possibility of uprisings. I didn't imagine the Arab uprisings were going to happen. I've thought a long time about political change in the region, about the possibility of political change. Ever since the revolution in Iran in 1979, lots of people who think about the region think about what revolution would look like, how it would come about, and we don't know. I mean, these are very complex human interactions at multiple levels, and recognizing the kind of the preconditions that exist that could produce kind of instability is one thing, but trying to forecast what that might produce, I think is really hard. I don't think it's possible. I think it's too human societies on a kind of domestic level, in terms of exogenous shocks, in terms of what outside actors are going to do. It's far too complex to think about in any predictive way. I think recognizing risk factors is about as far as we can go down this path. To say these conditions pertain in X countries, and beyond that, I don't think it's a productive way to think about analysis. I think in the early days after the coup in Egypt, there was a hope that sometimes masqueraded as analysis, kind of wishful thinking as analysis that saw uprising and mobilization just around the corner. And I think the Sisi regime is effectively over 7 years old now. It is maybe not fully consolidated, but largely consolidated, and it is a reality. It is not a productive reality in terms of Egyptian society, and it is not one that is going to produce good outcomes. But beyond that, is it going to produce a kind of reaction in revolution and uprising? I'd be a fool to try to predict such a thing, because I don't think it's possible. In terms of the Westphalian system, I guess it depends on what we're talking about. The state system is all the the state system has been eroded in some ways. Sovereignty has been eroded for a variety of reasons over recent decades. Globalization and interconnectedness in ways that circumvent the state, the rise of multinationals, all of these things are complicating factors and change the picture of the state system. But the state system remains. The content of the state system in terms of the states themselves, sure, that has evolved over time, but I don't really see any kind of near-term rival to the Westphalian state system. So I'm a skeptic. And of course, the erosion of the state in the region and really beyond, right? I mean, we see this all over the world, but the erosion of states is quite problematic. And our crisis of legitimacy is tied back to the crisis of governance. The crisis of the state in the Middle East is a real one because the state has eroded capacity in terms of providing for its citizens. And that's across the board of any kind of social indicator, whether it's education or health or security. And that's a real problem. State capacity remains a kind of underdeveloped feature of the Arab state system, and it's one that I see no easy solution to, but it remains kind of central to the struggle of everyday life of Arab citizens, it's a real tragedy. But the Arab states are are not in a position to provide for their citizens.
All right, so that's just about time. Thank you so much, Mr. Michael Wahid, Hanna. We are very grateful for this interesting and insightful presentation. I, for one, being from the region, really learned a lot today. And I also would like to thank our facilitator, Dr. Petros Vamvakis. So just before ending the event, I do want to remind everyone that we have a later presentation today, 12 EDT, 19 EET. It's going to be a panel discussion hosted by Dr. Vamvakis. And so just before I end everything, I do want to turn the floor over to Dr. Vamvakis for some final remarks. And again, thank you so much, Mr. Hanna. It was a pleasure meeting you.
Well, thank you from my end as well. And as promised, I think maybe it's symbolic when Mr. Hanna came on, it was dark behind him, and now the sun has risen and it's lighter. So maybe the things to come in the Eastern Mediterranean as we're moving to in a brighter spot all the way around. And I couldn't think of a better keynote than Mr. Hanna this morning. As Maria also mentioned, we're going to have a roundtable discussion at 12. Actually, it's going to be chaired by Professor Avranitopoulos, wrapping up this week at the Georgie Danis seminar that we have undertaken. I want to remind everybody that on the chat, we've also put a survey to fill out, so we ask people to fill that out. Again, Michael, I couldn't thank you enough. If I may call you Michael, I feel like that you really provided a great deal of insight for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Have a nice day.